everyone, and bienvenue. We have a special event to welcome you to tonight. This is, of course, Atelier 11, which has been sheltering artists for over 150 years as part of the Lair Arts organization. We are standing in the shadow of Vasyl Grubliak's Russian Kiss exhibit, built from actual authentic shrapnel from Russian rockets fired at Ukraine. Who do we have here tonight? We have various artists, admirers of the installation, and we also have most of the Lair Arts Board of Directors here to hear your thoughts tonight. Special thanks to our partner this evening, the Clooney Foundation for Justice. What this organization does is it builds on Amal Clooney's work in the battle against tyrants and genocides. They also free journalists who've been unfairly jailed. They fight in trials against perpetrators of war crimes, and they protect the rights of women and girls. As Amal Clooney wrote, Ukraine today is a slaughterhouse. I believe we got there by ignoring justice so long. Our job is to sustain the attention and keep the fight up long after the bright lights fade. And I think that's a big piece of what Vasyl's work here is doing. He described it to me the other day as a piece of anti-propaganda. It's also a cry for help. The war has been ongoing for a year. Let me talk a little bit about Dr. Anya Neistat. Today I'm humbled to welcome her. She's the legal director of the Docket Initiative at the Clooney Foundation for Justice. And once I'm done this talk, this intro will take about 3 more minutes. She'll talk to us for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. Please think of some good questions, real ones, hard ones. What is the Docket Initiative? Anya describes it on the website as, we created the docket to make justice for survivors of mass atrocities a reality. In other words, the docket pursues perpetrators and enablers of human rights offensives and tries to make tyrants accountable. Anya has been involved in international human rights work for more than 20 years and has conducted over 60 investigations in conflict areas. She was Amnesty International Senior Director for Research and also worked as the Associate Director for Program and Emergencies at Human Rights Watch. She's authored numerous human rights reports and opinion pieces and contributes regularly to legal and human rights debates in academic and policy institutions. She's chair of the board at Crisis Action, an international organization who works to protect civilians from armed conflict. It's a lot, but there's a little bit more. She's also on Netflix. Check out the documentary, E-Team, which I watched last night and was deeply moved by. Not only is Anya a doctor of law, she's the type of person who would smuggle herself in to a conflict zone, bear witness to the anguished stories of hundreds of survivors of genocide, and speak out against the power of tyrants. I'm very humbled to honor and to welcome Anya.
Thank you. Now, this session introduction, I'm slightly bummed about how much light I'm under, but thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm just looking at the installation. I was traveling a lot and leaving actually for Ukraine tomorrow, but I'm glad I got a glimpse of it. Thank you. I think it's really impressive piece of work. I'll speak English, but if you want to ask questions in French, in Ukrainian, in Russian, whatever works, I think we can do that as well. So a year ago, on February 24th, I woke up, like most of us, I'm sure, in horror. I wouldn't say, it was a shock, of course, but not in a sense that, for me at least, it was unexpected. I did unfortunately believe the intelligence reports, and I did not think that Russia, that Putin was bluffing. But I also remember the other very strong feeling that I had at that time, which was the feeling of hope. And this feeling came from all of these, I suppose, decades of work that came before that, because for me, this war did not start in February 2022. It did not even start in 2014, although I was at the time first on Maidan in Kiev and then in Donbass, and kept coming back in 2015 and 16 to document what was going on there. But for me, that war, basically the war of Russia in its current shape, Russia's current regime against everything that I would generally describe as humanity, started back in at least 99 with the war in Chechnya, especially the second war in Chechnya. The first war was equally brutal, but it had its own specifics. But the second war was where we started seeing the same patterns that we're currently seeing in Ukraine. And then it was Georgia, where I also worked for quite a long time during the war. The war was shorter, but it was, again, demonstrating the same disregard to human life and the same imperial ambition that, again, we now see in Ukraine. And then it was Syria. It was a different war, but the moment Russia stepped in, the nature of the war changed significantly. And the kind of abuses that we started witnessing, such as attacks on hospitals or massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, is something that started when Russia stepped in. And I have to say, all this time, the world looked away. And yes, I will never discount the efforts of some courageous diplomats, some of whom I know personally, some of whom are actually French, who tried their absolute best to stop the madness, who did not believe the assurances of the Russian government, who did not buy into the propaganda that was building up already then. But by and large, I do think that, I don't think, I know it because I witnessed it whenever I went to Strasbourg or Washington or London, Paris, trying to talk to foreign governments, to diplomats, to the UN officials about the fact that what's happening back then in Chechnya or then in Georgia or then in Syria should not be dismissed as some internal Russian affair or Russia's contribution to the global war on terror or whatever other excuses Russia was coming up with back then, but should be seen as a major shift compared to pre-Putin's years in Russia's policy, both foreign and internal. And all of that fell on deaf ears. And what we see today, as you know, in the quote from Amal, I do think that the impunity, the sense of impunity that it created amongst Russian leadership is what made February 24th, the full-scale invasion, the bombing of Ukrainian cities, possible. But going back to hope, that's where I think this hope came from, because very quickly it became clear to me that on one hand, Ukrainians will not give up. I don't know about you, but in the first couple of days it was not obvious. After all, you know, previous Ukrainian governments had different relationships with Russia, and it could have turned out very differently. But very quickly it became clear that, first of all, Russia with corruption and completely underperforming military cannot achieve its goals, but also because Ukrainians put up an absolutely unbelievable resistance, which continues to date. And at the same time, literally in the first few weeks in the last weeks of February, the first weeks of March, it became clear that the world, I hope, had enough. The reaction from the international community was very different from what we saw before. The particularly commitment to accountability, to which I'll get in a second, was something that I have not seen in 20 years. And so for me, the sense of hope came from the fact that I finally, for the first time in my career, a lot of which was spent on chasing Russian war criminals, started to have a sense that the end might be within sight, that this impunity will not be forever. And so from the first days, my teams got to work. I don't have a very large team, so we had to decide from the very first day what to focus on, because of course the scale of the crimes committed in Ukraine was and continues to be enormous. We focused on, so I'll probably talk mostly about the things that we worked on. This is not to kind of in any way suggest that there aren't other crimes being committed, but because that's something that I can talk about with certainty. So we focused on attacks directed at civilian infrastructure, against hospitals, against other civilian objects, or indiscriminate attacks. So attacks which were not directed at civilian objectives, but were done with such means and methods that inevitably led to unlawful loss of civilian life. We focused on executions, torture and disappearances, so abuses that were happening in areas that were occupied, at least for a short period of time, by Russian troops and by other units of the Russian military and police. And I have to say, the scale of those abuses is potentially significantly underreported, at least based on our observations. Of course, everybody knows about Bucha and Irpin and a few other places that were widely reported on in the media, but very few people know about the villages of Belistanka or Brovary and many other in the Kiev region that were equally affected. Not to mention, for example, most of the Kharkiv region, including Izum and many other small towns and villages that were under Russian occupation. Another crime that we focused on is sexual violence, rapes, and other forms of sexual violence, which again was reported initially quite a lot, but there is a huge gap between doing a journalistic report and actually building a case. And then finally we looked at the instances where civilians were trying to flee the areas where fighting was going on and were in many cases shot either as they were leaving on foot or as they were trying to flee in vehicles. So what we do is, I would say, a little bit unusual because we're both investigators and lawyers. So we collect information on the ground. So whenever I see pieces like that, I'm very tempted to come and have a close look and touch them, because this is exactly what allows us to identify what kind of weapons were used. And depending on the type of weapon, we can say quite a lot about the nature of the attack itself. We interview witnesses, we interview survivors, we collect sometimes material evidence because otherwise it often disappears. Fortunately, compared to some other investigations in which I was involved, in Ukraine, Russian forces were withdrawing very quickly in many cases, and they left a lot behind. Documents, literally in Kharkiv, when I was there last time, we were in Kharkiv region in some of the villages, we were walking through kindergartens and schools that were taken over by the Russian military or FSB or some other units that were there, walking through piles and piles of papers and uniforms and everything else that was left behind, which of course for us sometimes it was literally a small piece of paper that would contain their contact information or phone numbers, which essentially allows us to eventually identify the perpetrators. In other places they thought they would stay, so they were very easy with leaving marks on the walls, which also writing their unit numbers, sometimes their names, their nicknames, the regions that they were from, all of which helps us a lot. And also, unlike other conflicts that I worked on, unlike other wars that I worked on, there is enormous amount of information that can be accessed through open or semi-open sources. So we have a team that is working almost exclusively on so-called OSINT, open source intelligence gathering, and that includes everything from collecting satellite imagery, which in some cases is very helpful, to monitoring videos and photos that are being posted or that we can obtain otherwise, but also working a lot on social networks, particularly social networks that are frequent by Russian soldiers, Russian policemen. And I'm emphasizing, that it wasn't just Russian soldiers. In fact, so far we're seeing that in terms of abuses committed in the occupied areas, it was actually police and OMON and so-called Rosgvardi and some other units, which it's very important to remember that it's literally the whole apparatus of Russian security services that were involved in this. But all of them are very active in networks like Contact, in particular Telegram. So one of the things we're doing is, for example, establishing profiles in this network so that we can be in touch and so that we can be reached. Again, they leave lots of traces behind. So in that sense, the challenge here is not so much the lack of information, but probably the abundance of it, and going through all of that takes a lot of time. I will tell you in a second what we do with those cases and what others do with similar investigations, but I need to mention two other things on which we're starting to work very hard this year. One of those is specifically Mariupol. We touched on it in our first year, but we soon realized that this will be an enormous lift in terms of both investigation but also building a legal case. Because unlike some other instances, we decided that it would not be helpful to go, bombing by bombing or, unlawful arrest by unlawful arrest, but to actually build a case around the siege of Mariupol as a whole. Under international law, siege in itself is not a violation necessarily, but you can build it up in a way that would acknowledge the suffering of everybody who was in Mariupol. For me, this thinking started with meeting a few families who were quote-unquote lucky because they survived. They didn't lose family members, but listening to them describing what they went through for a few months in the basements of Mariupol was frankly one of the most horrendous things I've heard. Partially because I think my mind, given everything that I've seen in my life, just still refused to believe that in the 21st century it is possible that families would literally starve and be deprived of water or any kind of basic medical assistance, that they would not be able to brush their teeth and brush their hair for several months because they couldn't get out and because there was nothing. Anyway, so it was the horror of their stories made me think that we need to build a case that would actually acknowledge their suffering along with the suffering of those who lost their lives or lost their loved ones in Mariupol. I do think that this case will probably allow us to make a clear conclusion about crimes against humanity. I know that this phrase is already being used a lot, but to make a legal determination, we actually need to collect evidence that would support a court's conclusion that such crime was committed. And the other crime that we're starting to work very seriously this year, although we've been collecting information since the beginning, is the crimes committed by Russian propaganda figures. I, from the very beginning, felt that their contribution to what's happening on the ground in Ukraine is enormous. There are different legal ways in which to go about it. It could be incitement to genocide, it could be propaganda of war, but I do hope that we will be able to launch such cases this year so that these people do not get away with their contribution to the murder. There are many of them. We'll probably start with the most notorious ones, but hopefully would not stop there. And probably just to conclude, I'll go back to this. What is happening? Why is where does this hope that something will change this time comes from in terms of impunity? From the very beginning, there have been several accountability processes set in motion. International Criminal Court opened an investigation in the first weeks since February. It was kind of, for me, bittersweet. For everybody was very excited that it started so quickly. For me, it was bittersweet because the case was with the court since 2014. And it was in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, that Ukraine, which is not party to the Rome Statute, so in theory, the case could not be opened, but Ukraine invited the International Criminal Court to start an investigation. So they've been sitting on it for about 8 years. But okay, water under the bridge, they did open the investigation and they're working on it. Secondly, Ukrainian prosecutors. It's again a situation which we don't see, in Syria or Yemen or in Ethiopia. Ukrainian prosecutors are working very hard, collecting evidence. Ukrainian police, FBU, and everybody else. The problem, of course, is that they currently have 66,000 cases open. So it is very difficult to imagine how they would go through such massive volume of cases and of information. And then our niche is so-called universal jurisdiction. So we work on cases that can be launched elsewhere, outside of Ukraine. And again, from the very beginning, more than a dozen countries, mostly in Europe, but also in some other places like Canada, made a commitment to start investigations into cases, into crimes committed in Ukraine. Without going into many legal details, it works differently in every country, but essentially, given how many Ukrainians are now in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, and elsewhere in the world, they, in some cases, can become, they can launch criminal complaints. In other cases, we ourselves can bring cases to the attention of the prosecutors. It's not easy and it's not quick, but that's another and sometimes faster route to justice. Obviously, none of the perpetrators are currently in Europe, to the extent that we know, but what can happen as a result of such cases being open is that Germany or France or the Netherlands could issue an arrest warrant, which will be turned into Europol or Interpol red notice. And that means that wherever these people go, they can be arrested and extradited to the country that has a case. Why is it important? Because otherwise the opposite will be true. They will start traveling, and if there is no case, they will not be arrested and extradited. I'm sure some of you might have noticed the news about one of the Russian military commanders who was involved in crimes committed in Ukraine, leading Russia's operation in Turkey in relief to the earthquake, and nothing could be done to apprehend him because there was no case. Another example was when one of these Russian propaganda journalists traveled to Kosovo and actually got picked up, but very quickly handed over to Serbia and happily returned to Russia, again because there was no case in place against her and no arrest warrant. So to avoid these kind of things happening in the future, we're basically trying to flood all the prosecutors' offices that we can get access to with cases from Ukraine. Sometimes it's cases of people who are already in those countries, sometimes it's Ukrainians who are still in Ukraine, but who want to seek justice elsewhere or in parallel with cases that are happening in Ukraine. And one last thing, which is very important, is I'm sure you're aware of the efforts to create a tribunal for the crime of aggression, specifically. And I was slightly torn about that in the beginning because I think all of us who supported the creation of the International Criminal Court thought that the idea would be that this will be the tribunal and there will be no need to create ad hoc tribunals every time something like this is happening. But unfortunately, the International Criminal Court cannot take the crime of aggression on in case of Russia and Ukraine because neither country has ratified the Rome Statute, and so an additional court, an additional process would be needed. And I think now I'm convinced that it is absolutely critically important that the crime of aggression is prosecuted and tried in this case because it kind of puts everything that's happening in Ukraine in a different light. And those of you who are not lawyers, and I assume that not many lawyers amongst you would not feel my pain, but the problem is when we start looking into, for example, attacks committed with these types of weapons through only the lens of the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, there are very strict rules there. And that means that if in fact Russians were trying to hit a military target and accidentally or collaterally hit a civilian building nearby, that may or may not constitute a war crime. And it is, just historically, has been very, very difficult to build cases for so-called disproportionate attacks. So of course when you see a caliber missile fired into the middle of the city, regardless of where there is a weapon factory nearby, you would say that it's clear that people are going to die. And they do die in many of these cases. But to say that this attack was unlawful takes a lot of work in terms of gathering evidence, and in many cases we will not be successful. And people were not successful previously trying to do this in other wars. But the moment, and that's very frustrating, but the moment you step out of this framework of traditional kind of laws of war and accept that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is an act of aggression, which I don't think there is any doubt in anybody's mind, that puts a very different framework. Because then there is no such thing as a legitimate target, whether military or not, as long as it's being committed, this attack is being committed as a part of an act of aggression. So I do hope that this tribunal happens. It's difficult because it needs a high enough level of authorization to be able to overcome the immunity of state leaders like Putin. That's the problem why other countries, even if they open such cases, would not be able to do much with this. But for now, it seems like Europeans at least are very committed, and the Ukrainians are supporting this initiative. So I do hope that it takes place. And unfortunately, I would say that I'm surprised at the feeling of optimism that I had last year. As I said, it was hope, but it was also a feeling that, which I always have, I have to say, although I should have learned better, that it will be fast, that it's really the beginning of the end, and the end of what Russia currently is like, the Russian regime in its current form, will be near. Now, I see that it will probably take time, unfortunately, and we all saw how the military aid to Ukraine slowed down for a significant period of time. We also see how the promised accountability efforts are also going very slowly. They are going very slowly. France has opened 7 cases in March, April, and so far we're not aware of any progress in any of them. The International Criminal Court, everybody expected some announcements a year on, and we haven't heard much. But it will happen, and I'm very committed, at least personally, and with my team, to make sure that even if it is the worst crime committed by Russia's current regime, it will be its last one. Thank you.